A German shepherd was left to die in the snow. What he did next, no one could believe. Marion didn't expect to find anyone alive that morning, just frost, silence, and the distant howl of winter. But when a shadow stumbled across the road and collapsed, she hit the brakes. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a coyote. It was a dog half frozen, bleeding, and looking at her like he was waiting for someone to come. What followed wasn't just rescue, it was redemption. If you believe that loyalty can outlast loss and that some heroes walk on four legs, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us because this story is one you won't forget. The snow had come early that year to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, brushing the roofs with a soft white dusting like powdered sugar on gingerbread houses. The air was sharp and still, as if the entire town was holding its breath. Pine trees bowed under the weight of snow, and the winding road out of town gleamed slick in the morning sun. Marion Parker squinted through her windshield, gripping the wheel of her ancient Subaru with both hands. The heater hissed like a tired old dragon, doing its best to fend off the cold. Marion, at 66, was a tall, thin woman with silver-streaked hair she tied in a no-nonsense bun. Years of mountain living had toughened her joints and her voice, though both still had enough give to be gentle when needed. Her green eyes, once quick to smile, now held the quiet grief of someone who had buried too many chapters. She wore a wool coat that had once belonged to her husband, Arthur, and she hadn't replaced it in the 4 years since his sudden passing from a heart attack. Some things, she believed, were worth carrying, even if they no longer fit just right. She was on her way to deliver homemade apple pies to Gilroy's General Store, a small shop run by a friendly retired couple who insisted hers were better than anything in town. She made the drive every Thursday morning, winding past the base of the Teton Range where the trees grew thick and traffic thinned to nothing. Her thermos rattled in the cup holder. The radio played something soft and old. All was calm, predictable, until it wasn't. A blur of movement stumbled across the road ahead, low, fast, uneven. Marion slammed her foot on the brakes. The tires screamed. The Subaru skidded slightly before jerking to a stop. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She blinked at the snow-dappled shoulder, then flung the door open and stepped into the cold. It wasn't a deer, it was a dog, a large German shepherd, black and tan, dragging one leg and listing heavily to the side as if it had already been running for too long on too many injuries. One of its front legs was curled awkwardly under its body, and the left side of its chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven gasps. Blood streaked the snow beneath it, and small cuts above one eye stood out against the pale fur. Even in pain, the dog didn't bark or growl. It only looked at her with amber eyes, alert but collapsing. She knelt beside it, careful not to startle. "Hey, boy," she whispered, her voice cracking under the cold. "Where did you come from?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but it didn't try to bite her either. Instead, it let its head fall sideways onto the snowbank, and that small act of trust or surrender was what made Marion move. She pulled the emergency quilt from the trunk, the same faded blue one Arthur had kept for camping trips, and slowly spread it across the snow beside the dog. Her body protested every movement, but she worked with steady determination, edging the quilt beneath the dog's body one side at a time. Then she grasped the corners, braced her boots, and began to drag. The passenger door groaned open. Inch by inch, Marion pulled the dog toward the car, her breath coming in short gasps, pausing midway to rest her knees in the snow. At last, with one final tug, she slid the bundled dog onto the seat. He groaned softly but didn't resist. His eyes remained half-lidded, breathing shallow but steady. She climbed behind the wheel, panting, her hands shaking more from adrenaline than the cold now. "All right, buddy," she murmured, starting the car. "You're not dying in a ditch today. Not on my watch." The rest of the drive passed in tense silence. The dog barely moved. Every time she glanced over, Marion was certain she saw it stop breathing. But then it would twitch, or blink, or let out a soft grunt, and she would exhale again. Her cabin stood at the edge of the forest, about 10 minutes past the town line, tucked in a clearing with tall windows and a crooked chimney Arthur had built himself. As she pulled into the gravel driveway, a gust of wind flung snow from the trees like confetti. It felt like the mountains were watching. Inside, the warmth from the wood stove hit her like a wave. She cleared a space on the rug near the fire, layering down towels and blankets. Then, with as much care as her tired arms could muster, she angled the quilt and used gravity to ease the dog down from the car seat. He thudded softly onto the makeshift bed. She knelt beside him again, unwrapping the quilt slowly. His coat, despite the blood and dirt, was thick and healthy. He was clearly well fed, not a stray, but his right paw had an angry gash, and the bleeding along his ribs looked fresh. His left ear was notched, possibly from an old wound. There was a strength in his build, even while unconscious. This had once been a powerful trained dog. She knew enough from years living near forest rangers and avalanche teams. This wasn't some backyard pet. "Who left you out there?" she murmured. "And why?" He stirred then, just slightly. A low rumble came from his throat. Not a growl, more like a question. Marian reached out slowly and placed her palm on the uninjured part of his head. His fur was warm, coarse, real. She'd been living alone so long, it surprised her how solid he felt under her hand. For the next hour, Marian tended to him. She cleaned the wounds with warm water and iodine, her hands steady from years of nursing Arthur through winters and flu seasons. She spoke softly as she worked, telling him about her pies, about Arthur's terrible jokes, about how quiet the nights had become. She didn't expect him to understand, but the silence didn't feel quite so heavy when she filled it with something. At one point, he lifted his head slightly and sniffed the air. "That's chicken soup," she said with a half smile. "Don't get any ideas. You need rest first." She didn't name him, not yet. Naming made things real, and Marian had already buried one companion. She wasn't sure she could survive another. Still, when she placed a bowl of water near his muzzle and he took a single, hesitant sip, something inside her gave way. She sat back on her heels, arms limp at her sides. The fire crackled nearby, casting dancing shadows on the floor. And then, silently, Marian began to cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet breaking tears slipping down a face that hadn't let go in years. She covered her mouth with her hand, as if to keep it inside, but the tears came anyway. This dog, this broken stranger who had stumbled into her path, was breathing steadily by her fire, and somehow that shattered her. Outside, the wind howled across the snowy trees, but inside, beneath the quilt, a dog who should have died in the cold lay breathing, just barely on her floor. Morning came slowly, stretching gold fingers across the frosted window panes. Marian sat on the worn armchair by the fire, her tea going cold in her hands. The dog, still unnamed in her mind, but undeniably real in her living room, lay exactly where she'd left him the night before, his breathing shallow but rhythmic, his ears occasionally twitching, as if tuned to a frequency only he could hear. His eyes had flickered open once or twice, but they held no panic, only that same weary alertness. He hadn't moved much, and he hadn't eaten. The bowl of water remained mostly untouched. The can of wet food she'd placed near him, opened and slightly warmed, had gone cold. Marian wasn't sure if he didn't like the smell, or simply didn't trust her yet. Perhaps both. She kept her distance at first, just the occasional word when passing through the room, a light hum when she tended the fire. But the silence had weight, and by afternoon she began to talk, half to herself, half to him. "I suppose I can't keep calling you boy forever," she said, standing in the kitchen with flour-dusted hands. "That's not very dignified for someone who probably outranks me in discipline." She waited. The dog blinked once, his eyes following the sound of her voice. "Well, how about Bruno?" she tried. "Feels strong, steady, like a man who doesn't say much but notices everything. No protest, no tail wag either. But there was something in the way his gaze lingered that made her smile. She nodded to herself. "Bruno, it is." That afternoon, the first snow since the storm began to fall again, light like ash. And Marian moved Bruno's blankets closer to the fire. She had just finished preparing dinner. Roasted carrots, mashed potatoes, and leftover chicken soup, when a knock sounded at the back screen door. It was Liam. The boy from next door was 10, with a mop of sandy blonde hair that was never quite combed and cheeks that flushed easily in the cold. He was small for his age, with wiry arms and a nervous habit of tugging at his sleeves when he talked. His clothes were clean, but always a little too big, as if he were meant to grow into them, but hadn't caught up yet. "Hi, Miss Marian," he said, glancing over his shoulder like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to be here. "I brought your mail. It was in our box again." Marion opened the door wider. "That old postman can't tell our driveways apart, can he? Thank you, sweetheart. Come in, it's freezing." He hesitated just a moment before stepping inside. The warm air seemed to loosen his shoulders. Then his eyes locked on Bruno. "Whoa," Liam breathed. Marion followed his gaze. Bruno, half-lidded and drowsy near the hearth, had lifted his head and was watching the boy quietly, ears forward, muscles still. A soldier in half-sleep. "Is he yours?" Liam asked. He moved slowly, instinctively cautious. "Not exactly. He sort of found me," Marion replied. "He was hurt. I think he used to be a working dog, maybe with the Rangers. I'm just trying to get him through the week." Liam knelt several feet away from the dog. He didn't reach out, didn't speak, just sat with his legs crossed on the rug, watching. Bruno watched back. "They do that?" Liam said after a minute. "Do what?" "Stare, like they're looking through you. My granddad used to have one. Said you never had to talk to them. They just knew." Marion tilted her head. "Did you like the dog?" Liam shrugged. "He was nice. He died when I was 6. We haven't had any pets since." He said it flatly, like someone reporting the weather. But Marion noticed the way his fingers curled against the hem of his hoodie. She also noticed the faint purplish bruise on his wrist. "Would you like some cocoa?" she asked gently. Liam's face brightened a little. "Yes, please." As Marion moved to the kitchen, she could hear the quiet shift of the rug. Peeking around the corner, she saw Bruno had extended his front leg slightly, the one that wasn't injured, toward Liam's side. Not quite touching, just close. Liam, in turn, had leaned ever so slightly toward him. By the time Marion returned with 2 steaming mugs, the boy and the dog were sitting in a silent sort of accord. Liam sipped his cocoa without taking his eyes off Bruno. "My mom gets really tired sometimes," he said suddenly without looking up. "She sleeps a lot, doesn't like when I make noise." Marion sat down quietly beside him. "That sounds hard." Liam gave a small nod. "It's not her fault. She says her head gets heavy." Marion didn't ask more. Some truths only needed to be spoken once. She placed a third mug, an empty one between them, on the rug. For Bruno. Symbolic. It stayed untouched, but the gesture remained. The next day Liam came back. This time he brought a library book about dogs and read aloud softly while Bruno dozed. Marion noticed how the dog seemed less tense when the boy was near, how his ears flicked toward Liam's voice. By the third visit, Bruno took a few tentative bites of food with Liam nearby. As the week wore on, the bond deepened. Marion watched it happen like someone watching old film reels in reverse grief untangling itself, strand by strand. Liam started to smile more. Marion began baking again. Bruno, though still recovering, began to shift positions more often, sometimes resting his chin on Liam's shoe. Once, when Liam fell asleep curled beside the hearth, Marion covered him with a second blanket and sat beside them. Bruno's gaze met hers across the sleeping child, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something more than wariness in his eyes. Recognition, maybe. Or gratitude. That night, long after Liam had gone home, Marion found herself sitting in the quiet again, knitting by the fire. Bruno, now resting with his head tucked against the armchair, let out a low, content sigh. "You're not just healing," she murmured. "You're helping." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, 3 broken things, an old woman, a quiet boy, and a silent dog, had begun, in their own ways, to put each other back together. Bruno had been with Marion for nearly 2 weeks when she felt something unusual beneath the thick fur on his shoulder. An odd ridge, faint and narrow, hiding under the surface like a secret. She paused, brushing her fingers over it again. It wasn't a scar. It was too symmetrical, too cold. A chip. She'd suspected something for days, ever since that first night when she'd cleaned his wounds and seen the strength still living under all that exhaustion. The silence. The discipline. The way he responded not to noise, but to presence. She'd lived near enough forest rangers and avalanche teams to recognize a trained dog when she saw one. But she hadn't wanted to push. Not while he was still healing. Not while the weight of whatever he carried was still sinking out of him like snowmelt. Now, with her fingers resting on that sliver of artificial memory, Marion knew the time had come. Time to ask the question neither of them had dared speak aloud. The next morning, she bundled him in the quilt and loaded him into the back of her Subaru, this time with the help of a simple wooden ramp she and Liam had rigged using leftover lumber from Arthur's workshop. Bruno walked up it with some effort but without resistance, as if he understood they were going somewhere important. The town's veterinary clinic, Pinedale Animal Medical, stood at the edge of Main Street next to a snow-dusted hardware store. The windows were fogged from warmth, and a small sign outside read, "Walk-ins welcome animals and humans alike." Marion pushed through the door, the overhead bell jingling. The place smelled of pine disinfectant and kibble. Behind the counter sat Dr. Ellen Fairbanks, a woman in her early 50s with dark curls pulled back into a frizzy bun and laugh lines carved deep into her cheeks. She wore forest green scrubs with faded paw prints along the edges. Ellen had worked in Jackson Hole for more than 20 years and had a reputation for being both brilliant and blunt. She loved animals more than people, some whispered, but Marion had always found her surprisingly kind beneath the sarcasm. "Marion Parker," Ellen said, squinting over her glasses. "And that must be the famous stray I've heard about." "He's not a stray," Marion replied, placing a steady hand on Bruno's back. "I think he's something else. I think he used to belong to someone who mattered." Ellen stepped around the counter and crouched before Bruno, letting him sniff her hand. "Well, you've got a soldier's eyes, don't you?" she murmured. "Let's get a look at you." She led them into the examination room, a cozy space painted a soft sage green. There were faded posters of dog anatomy on the walls and a basket of well-loved chew toys in the corner. Marion helped guide Bruno onto the table. He tolerated the poking and prodding with stoic grace until Ellen gently pressed her fingers to his shoulder. "There it is," Ellen said, retrieving a handheld scanner. The beep came almost instantly. "Registered chip," she confirmed, eyes narrowing. "Hold on." She typed quickly on her desktop computer, her fingers flying across the keys. Marion stood silently, one hand resting on Bruno's back. The room felt smaller with each passing second. Finally, Ellen leaned back in her chair. "Bruno's real name is B712, assigned to Wyoming Search and Rescue under the Forest Service. Handler, Sergeant Jacob Reed, last reported active 2 months ago. Location, Bridger Teton, Avalanche Zone." Marion closed her eyes. She had guessed as much, but hearing it aloud turned a quiet truth into something harder. He had a number, a rank, a partner. "There was a team that went missing out there," Ellen continued quietly. "I remember hearing about it. Jacob Reed was declared dead found under a collapsed snowbank. They said the dog had disappeared, presumed dead too." "But he wasn't," Marion whispered. "No," Ellen said, reaching out to gently touch Bruno's ear. "He stayed. Probably wouldn't leave the body. That's what they do, the K9s. They stay with their partners, sometimes for days. I've seen it before. When he finally left, he must have been out there for a long time on his own." Marion looked at Bruno, at the scars, the fatigue still buried in his bones. And then she looked out the window, where soft snow had begun to fall again. "He didn't wander into my life," she said. "He survived to get here." They sat in silence for a while. Ellen offered to reach out to the Forest Service, to notify them that the dog had been found, but Marion hesitated. "What would they do?" she asked. "Usually the dog is retired, sometimes reassigned, but Bruno's injuries and trauma likely rule that out. They might send someone to retrieve him for evaluation." "No," Marion said firmly. "He's not going back to a kennel." Ellen raised an eyebrow. "You planning on keeping a government-trained rescue dog in your living room?" "I'm planning on giving a soldier a home," Marion replied. After a long pause, Ellen sighed. "There's a process. You'd have to apply for formal retirement adoption through the federal program, medical evaluation, paperwork, possibly even training certifications, and a letter from your vet." "You'll write it?" Ellen snorted. "Did I say no?" Later that day, back at the cabin, Marion printed out everything she could find on K9 retirement protocols. She laid the documents in careful stacks on the dining table, organized by steps and signatures needed. Bruno lay nearby, his eyes tracking her movement with quiet interest. He still didn't play or bark, but when Marion brushed past him carrying papers, he would gently nudge her hand with his nose. That evening, Liam stopped by again, cheeks flushed from the cold and a snow-crusted backpack over his shoulder. He froze when he saw the spread of papers. "Are they taking him?" he asked, voice thin. Marian shook her head. Not if I can help it. Relief softened the boy's features. He dropped his bag by the door and sat cross-legged next to Bruno. Liam was beginning to open up more with each visit, though never much about home. He spoke of school, of how he liked science but hated the cafeteria noise. He told Marian about his dream of being a pilot someday, of flying over the mountains like a hawk. Bruno always listened, head slightly tilted, as if filing each word away. That night, Marian stayed up late filling out the first application. There were more steps than she expected, more bureaucracy, but each page filled felt like a step forward, not just for Bruno, but for her. Bruno had a name now, a history, and perhaps a future. The storm outside picked up, whistling through the pines, but inside the cabin there was warmth, and the low sigh of a dog sleeping with one ear always turned toward the door, as if still waiting for a command that might never come. But now, he wasn't alone. The snowstorm rolled in faster than the forecast had warned. By dusk, Marian's windows had already frosted over in thick layers, and the wind had begun to howl across the roof, making the cabin creak and groan like an old ship caught at sea. She had double-checked the firewood, boiled a kettle for tea, and made a stew that would last through tomorrow, just in case they lost power. Jackson Hole had seen worse winters, but something about this one felt heavier. Like it wasn't just the snow that was coming, but memory itself, wrapped in white silence. Bruno lay in his usual spot by the hearth, his eyes half-lidded but alert. He had started sleeping with his head on Marian's slippers, as if guarding them. His body, though still mending, had gained strength. The gash in his side had healed to a scar, and the limp in his step was no longer constant. He moved with quiet intent now, as if relearning what it meant to live without orders. Marian sat by the fire, knitting a scarf with thick burgundy yarn, her needles clacking softly in rhythm with the wind outside. She was halfway through a row when a frantic knocking broke the stillness. Not the front door, the back. She rose quickly, Bruno already on his feet beside her. He didn't bark, he never barked, but his ears pricked forward, his stance protective. When she opened the door, a gust of snow punched inward, and through it stumbled a small figure shivering, soaked, and breathless. "Liam!" Marian gasped. The boy looked up at her, his face blotchy from wind and panic. He didn't speak, just stood there trembling in a wet hoodie 2 sizes too big, his shoes soaked through. Bruno stepped forward and let out a low, questioning sound, not quite a growl, more like concern shaped into breath. Marian pulled Liam inside, shutting the door behind them. She stripped off his outer layers with practiced hands, draped a towel around his shoulders, and led him to the fire without asking questions. Bruno pressed close as Liam sat down, and the boy immediately leaned into him, burying his fingers in the dog's fur. His lips were blue, his eyes glassy. It wasn't until Marian brought him a mug of hot cocoa that he finally spoke, his voice as small as the wind behind double-paned glass. She left again. Marian didn't ask who. She didn't need to. Liam stared into the fire. I think she meant to come back, but she forgot. Or maybe she didn't. The words fell between them like ice cracking underfoot. Marian felt the ache bloom in her chest, not for the first time, but deeper now. She placed a hand on Liam's shoulder, steady and warm. Bruno shifted, adjusting his position so the boy could rest against his side fully. They stayed that way for hours. Outside, the wind howled louder, sweeping snow in waves against the porch. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Marian lit candles around the room, their soft golden glow casting shadows on the walls. She filled a hot water bottle, wrapped it in a flannel case, and tucked it beside Liam, who had dozed off beside Bruno on the rug. She didn't sleep. Not really. Instead, she sat in the rocking chair Arthur had built, listening to the breathing of boy and dog, both broken in different ways and somehow repairing one another just by being close. She drank tea in silence, wrapped in an old quilt, and watched the fire burn low but steady. Bruno's eyes met hers once, across the flickering shadows. They held no fear, only calm readiness. A sentinel in the storm. Somewhere between one blink and the next, Marian's eyes grew heavy. The wind softened, the candlelight flickered, warm and low. And for a brief while, just minutes maybe, her chin sank to her chest and she dozed, rocked gently by the chair's familiar rhythm. The kind of sleep that wasn't full but deep enough to remind her she was still human. She woke to silence, not the kind that frightens, but the kind that follows a storm's passing. When dawn finally came, pale and gold and slow, it brought a hush to the world. The storm had passed, but its weight lingered in the white drifts outside. Marian stood and stretched. Her back ached, her feet were stiff, but something inside her felt centered. Liam stirred first. His hair stuck up in odd directions, and he blinked at the fire with a child's confusion at waking somewhere safe. Bruno lifted his head and gave a short, soft huff. "Sorry," Liam said groggily. "I didn't mean to fall asleep here." "You didn't," Marian replied, crouching to pour him another mug of cocoa. "You needed to. That's different." Liam smiled sleepily and rubbed his face with both hands. "He didn't leave me all night." "No," Marian said, her gaze resting on Bruno. "He didn't." Later, after breakfast and a proper change of clothes, Marian walked Liam home through the snow. The path was quiet, lined with the bent backs of pine trees, their branches heavy with memory. Liam's house was still locked. Marian knocked, then used the emergency key Liam showed her once, hidden beneath a loose porch board. Inside, the heat was off. The silence was thick. Sarah, in her early 40s, thin and angular with long, dull hair and a gaze that flickered too fast, stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly out the window. She wore a robe and mismatched socks. She turned when she heard the door, confusion briefly flashing across her features before recognition settled like a fog. "Liam?" she asked. Her voice was raw from sleep or something deeper. "He's fine," Marian said gently. "He stayed with me last night. The storm was bad." Sarah blinked. Her lips parted slightly as if something rose in her throat, words, maybe, but nothing came out. Her eyes shimmered with something between shame and relief, a tension suspended in silence. "I didn't mean to." "I know," Marian said quietly. They didn't say more. Back at the cabin, Marian refilled the bird feeders and brought in more firewood. Bruno followed her everywhere now, close but unobtrusive, like a shadow stitched to her heels. That afternoon, while folding laundry, she looked down and found him sitting in the hallway, eyes fixed on the front door. "You're still watching?" she said softly. He looked at her, then back at the door, then walked over and laid down beside it, his head resting between his paws, his ears relaxed, not anxious, just waiting. That night, Marian sat by the fire again. Liam had returned home, and Sarah had promised to call. Marian knew she might not, but the promise was something, progress, even if fragile. Bruno curled at her feet, and for the first time, she reached down and scratched gently behind his ears. "You're not just healing, are you?" she said. "You're protecting us, still working, still serving." His tail thumped once against the rug. From that moment, there was no longer a question. Bruno wasn't a guest. He wasn't a temporary soul passing through. He was family, the kind that doesn't need permission to stay. And no matter what paperwork remained, what whispers came from town, or how long the process stretched, Marian had already made her decision. Bruno was home. It was a Wednesday morning when the knock came, a sharp, rhythmic rapping that sounded nothing like the polite taps of neighbors or the gentle patter of Liam's small fists. Marian wiped her flour-covered hands on a dish towel, heart tightening just slightly. Bruno had stiffened in the hallway before she even reached the door, his body alert, his stance cautious but silent. He stood beside her now, ears forward, tail still. She opened the door to find a man in uniform. Lieutenant Daniel Avery stood tall, lean-built, but solid through the shoulders, with a clean-shaven face and a quiet steel behind his eyes. He looked to be in his late 30s, dressed in the navy blue tactical winter jacket of the Wyoming Forest K-9 Division, complete with a worn leather badge on his chest and snowflakes melting into his collar. His boots were muddy and scarred, and his hands were bare despite the cold, as if he had things to do too quickly for gloves. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and firm. "You must be Marian Parker." "I am," she answered slowly, one hand instinctively touching Bruno's back. "And you must be here for him." The lieutenant nodded once. "B712. We got the paperwork from the vet and from the adoption request. I wanted to see him myself before the transfer was finalized." Marian stepped aside reluctantly, allowing the officer in. Bruno didn't move, but his body was taut with recognition. Not fear, something deeper. Something like duty rising to the surface. Lieutenant Avery knelt on one knee and removed his cap. "Hello, partner," he said softly. "You remember me?" Bruno approached slowly, no tail wag, no growl, but he stood tall and pressed his nose lightly to Avery's outstretched palm. The lieutenant bowed his head for a moment, letting his hand rest behind Bruno's ear. "I was Jacob Reed's commanding officer," he explained, looking up at Marion. Bruno here was his second pair of eyes in the field. They were a hell of a team. "I know," Marion said, keeping her voice steady. "I read everything I could." "I imagine you did." Avery stood, dusting snow from his pant leg. "Listen, Mrs. Parker, he's technically still government property. We have a process for K-9 retirement, yes, but it's not always a guarantee. Some dogs are retrained, some go to other handlers, especially ones like him, still strong, still sharp." Marion's heart sank, but she nodded. "And if I ask to keep him? Then I'm supposed to recommend evaluation, at the center." Bruno's eyes tracked the lieutenant's every move, but his paws stayed planted beside Marion. No leash, no command, just presence. "I haven't put him in a kennel," Marion said quietly. "Not even once. He sleeps on blankets near the fire. He eats when Liam is around. He doesn't bark. He's not lost. He just chose to stay." Avery's eyes flicked to the hallway. There, in the warmth of the house, stood Liam. The boy had come in quietly, backpack slung off one shoulder, snow in his hair. He looked between Marion and the officer, then down to Bruno, who turned and walked toward him, pressing his body gently into Liam's side. Liam didn't speak, just placed his hand on Bruno's head like he always did. "You've got yourself a unit," Avery muttered. "No, Lieutenant," Marion said, a faint smile tugging at the edge of her lips. "We've got ourselves a family." He didn't argue, just gave a short nod and said he'd need a few days to report back to his supervisor. He left just before sunset, and the silence that followed felt like the lingering echo of a threat not spoken but not forgotten. That night, Marion couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned beneath her quilts, the wind rattling softly against the windows like nervous thoughts. She'd done everything right, submitted forms, obtained letters, even spoken to a retired ranger about local ordinance exemptions, but she couldn't shake the worry that bureaucracy might win anyway. She finally rose and checked the living room. Bruno wasn't on his bed near the hearth. She panicked for a moment, then turned toward the hallway and stopped. There, curled tightly across her bedroom doorway, lay Bruno. Not whining, not blocking, just there, his head on his paws, his back to the wall, guarding, choosing. Her breath caught. No words were exchanged, none were needed. In the morning, Marion took a picture of Bruno lying at her door, emailed it to Ellen the vet, and asked her to add it to the file. Then she sat down and wrote one more letter to the Forest Service. This one not about ownership or retirement status, but about belonging. It worked. 2 weeks later, a final notice came through. Bruno was officially released from federal service, reassigned to private civilian rehabilitation care under Marion Parker. A signature, a stamp, and that was it. The weight slid off Marion's chest like a stone from thawing ground. She didn't celebrate with a party. She baked. The very next week, Marion reopened her old kitchen workshop, the one she and Arthur used to run before he passed. She didn't hang a new sign or place ads. She just started baking again. Pies, biscuits, cinnamon scones, and word got out. She also reached out to Sarah. Sarah arrived hesitantly, hair combed but pulled tight, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. She wore a faded gray cardigan and jeans a size too small. When Marion invited her in, Sarah didn't look her in the eye at first, but she didn't leave either. "I'm not always good around people," Sarah admitted, voice low, hands clasped around a chipped mug of tea. "But I'm good at recipes, and I remember every measurement after reading it once." "I don't need you to be good at people," Marion said. "I just need a second pair of hands." That was how it started. Bruno would sit in the corner of the kitchen, watching the two women knead and sift and pour. Sarah spoke more slowly now, and Marion listened without filling the silences. Sometimes Liam joined them, reading recipes out loud or licking beaters. Sometimes he just sat with Bruno on the back steps while the oven warmed the air. And when a neighbor dropped by one snowy afternoon and asked how long Bruno would be staying, Marion didn't hesitate. "He's not staying," she said. "He lives here. Spring arrived in Jackson Hole not with a dramatic thaw, but with a gradual unfolding snow melting in seams along the fence lines, robins returning to the trees, and the light staying just a little longer each evening. The pines still carried the memory of winter, but the sun had begun to press gently into the earth, waking it inch by inch. It was the kind of spring that made you pause mid-step just to breathe. Inside Marion Parker's cabin, the warmth wasn't just from the fireplace anymore. The kitchen buzzed with quiet life. The counters were flowered and cluttered. Laughter drifted between shelves, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh bread curled through the air like a hymn. The old wooden sign above the door had been scrubbed clean and repainted in soft green and cream, Sweet Haven. Bruno lay near the window, paws crossed, head raised, watching the world outside. He was heavier now, no longer the underfed creature Marion had dragged inside on that stormy day. His coat gleamed in the afternoon light, black and tan and thick with health, and his eyes, once weary and sunken, now held a steady, watchful calm. He didn't bark when the door opened or the bell above it chimed. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to keep the space grounded. Customers often paused to glance his way, drawn not by fear or curiosity, but by something deeper like recognizing an old soul across a crowded room. Liam had grown bolder too. The boy, now freshly 11, had begun helping with small deliveries, balancing pie boxes in both arms as he darted up porches and returned with dollar bills and thank you notes. His shoulders stood straighter now, and the nervous tug at his sleeves had faded to the occasional fidget of a thoughtful child. He read out loud more recipes, comics, letters, and sometimes sang under his breath when no one was listening, or when he thought no one was listening. Bruno, of course, always was. Sarah came every day. The transformation had not been immediate. At first she had arrived stiff and apologetic, always bringing something unnecessary, a bag of flour, extra eggs, a handwritten label, as if afraid to show up empty-handed. But slowly, like the snow giving way to crocus stems, she changed. Sarah was still thin, her clothes always a size too sharp at the shoulders, but her movements had softened. Her hair, once constantly knotted in a bun, now often fell loose across her cheeks. She smiled more. Not the wide, performative kind, but the small, sincere curve that came when she reached for a teacup or corrected Liam gently instead of snapping. The quiet in her had become a kind of grace, not a wound. Marion watched her one afternoon, laughing with Liam over a jam spill, and thought how rarely people noticed the bravery in ordinary survival. They had become a rhythm 3 humans and 1 dog, moving together through the slow dance of days. The community had taken notice too. Customers returned weekly for Marion's scones and Sarah's delicate lattice pies. One elderly man brought fresh rhubarb from his garden just to see what Marion would do with it. Another woman from the quilting group offered to embroider aprons with their names. Even Tom Bradley, the ever-skeptical neighbor, came by more often, claiming he just needed extra jam, though he never left without sneaking Bruno a biscuit. "Guess your dog's a local celebrity now," he muttered one day. Marion smiled. He earned it. The real moment of change, however, came with the small ceremony. Liam had insisted they have one. "You can't open a shop without a grand opening," he said seriously, clutching a clipboard he'd made from the cardboard and tape. "Even if it's already open, you have to make it official." And so they did. It was nothing grand, just a dozen people from the neighborhood, folding chairs on the porch, and a table of pastries under the awning. Marion wore her good cardigan, Sarah brought lemonade in mason jars, and Liam gave a speech that involved the phrase, "best dog in the whole state," repeated at least 4 times. The new sign was revealed with a tug of a ribbon, Sweet Haven, hand-lettered with vines curling along the edges. Underneath, in Liam's scrawled block print, "Home is where the dog is." Marion stood beside Bruno, her hand resting gently on his back. He sat tall and silent, the same way he had on that first night when he stood between her and the dark, not with force, but with presence. And as the last of the sun pooled across the gravel path and the guests laughed and clapped, Marion leaned down and whispered close to his ear. "Everyone thinks I rescued you," she said softly. "But we both know the truth, don't we?" Bruno turned his head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't move. He just looked at her, deep and calm and sure. "You saved this whole house," she murmured. That night, after the chairs had been stacked and the table cleared, Marion lit a candle in the kitchen and watched Bruno sleep near the stove. Liam had gone home. Sarah had stayed behind to clean. The soft hum of contentment filled the air. Marion leaned on the doorframe, her arms folded, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the ache of silence pressing at the windows. The house wasn't full, it was just full enough. A home that fit. Sometimes, the wildest hearts just need a place to feel safe. Bruno wasn't just a dog lost in the snow. He was a soul waiting to be seen, a soldier longing for home. And Marion didn't just rescue him. She made space for healing, for connection, and for a family that didn't need to be perfect, just true. In a world that often rushes past quiet pain, this story reminds us, the greatest rescues go both ways. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who believes in second chances. Leave a comment below and tell us who has been your silent protector in life.